She was 14 years old and she was standing in the middle of a courtroom that smelled like old wood and cold air, and every adult in the room was waiting for her to either cry or sit back down. She did neither. The judge, a woman with silver hair pulled tight and eyes that had seen too many things to be surprised by most of them, had just said those words. The words that felt like a door slamming in a very small room. If you cannot provide evidence of your father's whereabouts on the night of March 14th, this court has no choice but to proceed to sentencing. He will go to prison today. The girl's name was Marisol Reyes. She was wearing her school shoes, the ones with the scuff on the left toe that her father kept meaning to fix, and a blue blouse that was slightly too big for her because it had been her mother's, and she'd grown into it slowly over the years without anyone telling her to. Her hair was in one long braid down her back. She stood up from the gallery bench. Everyone, the prosecutor, the defense lawyer, the court reporter, the bailiff, the 12 people in the jury box. Everyone looked at her, and Marisol Reyes opened her mouth, and she sang. If this story is already finding its way into your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to Mama Told Me, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. Mama always said kindness travels farther than you think. Now, let me tell you how we got to that moment, because moments like that don't just happen. They build, they accumulate. Or they are made of 100 smaller things. A father's voice in a dark room, a child's memory that turns out to be sharper than anyone gave it credit for, and a choice made by a girl who had been told in 100 different ways that her word didn't count for anything. Mama always said that the truth doesn't need an audience to be true. She said it has a way of finding its way out, even through the smallest opening, even through the throat of a 14-year-old girl in school shoes in a courtroom that smelled like dust and judgment. But we are not there yet. We need to go back. Back to the apartment on Delancey Street, back to the radiator that clicked 3 times before it sighed, back to the beginning of a story that started, like most important stories do, on an ordinary night. No, the world on Delancey Street. The building at 214 Delancey Street was the kind of building that had been almost renovated twice, and both times the money ran out. The lobby tiles were cracked in a pattern that Marisol had memorized the way you memorize the face of someone you love. Not deliberately, just by looking long enough. The elevator was usually out of service. The hallway on the 4th floor smelled like someone's cooking always, a rotating cast of garlic and onion and something frying. And once, memorably, a neighbor had made something with tamarind that had drifted under 3 doors and settled into the walls for a week. The Reyes apartment was 4C, 2 bedrooms, 1 window in the living room that looked out at the brick wall of the building next door, known close enough that Marisol used to pretend the 2 buildings were whispering to each other. Her bedroom window faced the street, and from it she could see the bus stop and the corner store, and if she craned slightly to the left, the very edge of the park where her father used to take her on Sunday afternoons, when she was small enough to fit on his shoulders. Carlos Reyes had worked the night shift for 11 years. He was the kind of man who ironed his uniform even though no one required it. The kind of man who kept a list on the refrigerator of things that needed fixing. The left cabinet hinge, the water pressure in the bathroom, the scuff on Marisol's shoe, and worked through it slowly, methodically on weekends with the radio on low. He was not a man who talked much. He was a man who did, quietly, steadily. I'm without asking anyone to notice. He had raised Marisol alone since she was 7. Her mother, Elena, had died of a blood clot the doctor said had been forming for years without anyone knowing. She was 31 years old. She had been alive on a Thursday and gone by Saturday, and Carlos had stood in the kitchen for a long time afterward, very still, holding a dish towel, not crying, not speaking, just standing the way a tree stands after lightning, still upright but changed at the core. He never spoke badly of the situation. He never said, "Why us?" or "It isn't fair," at least not where Marisol could hear him. What he did was learn how to braid hair. Badly at first, then less badly. Then well enough that Marisol stopped wincing when he did it. He learned how to make the rice the way Elena had made it. Now adding a bay leaf and a small pat of butter that didn't belong there culinarily but tasted like her somehow. He went to every school meeting, every parent-teacher conference, and sat in chairs designed for smaller people, with his big janitor's hands folded in his lap, and listened with complete attention. He was not a perfect man. He was late sometimes. He forgot things. He had a habit of leaving his boots by the front door where Marisol tripped on them, and after the third time she had made a sign on a piece of notebook paper that said, "Boot Graveyard," with an arrow pointing to the mat by the door. And he had laughed. Really laughed. For the first time in longer than either of them could remember. The sign stayed on the door for 3 years. Marisol's asthma had started at 9, the winter after her mother died. The doctor said it might have always been there, waiting. Grief had a way of opening doors in the body that had been sealed. Carlos had spent 2 weeks reading everything he could find about childhood asthma and came home from the library with photocopied pages and a list of questions for the doctor that the doctor later told his colleague, slightly awed, was the most thorough intake document he'd received from a parent in years. The medication was manageable. The attacks were not always manageable. When they came, the bad ones, the ones at 2 in the morning where Marisol couldn't find the bottom of a breath, Carlos would sit on the edge of her bed and sing. It wasn't a real song. Not at first. It was just sounds, low and rhythmic. His voice doing what his hands couldn't, traveling into the tight space of her lungs somehow, making something unclench. Over the years, it had accumulated words, the way things accumulate in a house you live in long enough, organically without deciding to. Lines about the bedroom ceiling where a crack ran from the light fixture to the corner, like a river finding its way somewhere. Lines about the radiator that clicked 3 times before it sighed, reliable as a heartbeat. Lines about the color of the streetlight through the curtain, orange amber, the way it pooled on the floor like spilled something warm. Marisol had heard the song so many times she knew every word. She didn't know yet that those words were going to matter. The night of March 14th. It had been a hard winter, and March had not yet decided to be spring. The 14th fell on a Tuesday. Marisol had come home from school feeling the familiar warning tightness in her chest. Not an attack yet, just the threat of one, the weather pressure dropping, the air doing what it sometimes did. She had made tea because her father had shown her which kind helped. Ginger, a little honey. And she had sat at the kitchen table with her homework and told herself it would pass. It didn't pass. By 7 o'clock, the tightness was a grip. By 8, she had used the inhaler twice and was sitting up in bed because lying flat made it worse, and the rain had started. Not gentle rain, not spring rain, but the sideways kind that came with wind, that hit the window at an angle, that sounded like someone throwing fistfuls of gravel against the glass. Carlos had been supposed to go to work. He had texted his supervisor, a man named Dan Pryor, that he wouldn't be in. "My daughter is sick. Asthma. I'll make up the hours Friday." He had not called because Marisol needed quiet, and he was already sitting on her bed, one big hand resting on the back of her smaller one. The television in the living room murmuring to itself. The late local news, something about the city stadium installing new lighting for the summer season. The anchor's voice bright and cheerful about something that felt very far away from a 4th-floor bedroom where a girl was trying to breathe. He sang to her. The new verse, the one he made up that night, slow and quiet while the rain came sideways, and the clock on her nightstand said 9, then 9:15, then 9:30, was about exactly that, about the rain, about the sideways kind, about how it made the window look like it was crying, but that was okay. Because rain had to go somewhere, about how he would stay until her breathing slowed. He would always stay. The clock said 9, the moon was gone, the rain came sideways down our street. I sang until your fever broke and felt your heartbeat slow to sleep. Marisol's breathing steadied around 10:30. Carlos was asleep in the chair beside her bed by 11, still in his work uniform, his boots still on, a man who had meant to go in and simply couldn't leave. At that same hour, across town, someone was breaking into the safe at Harrington Properties. The accusation: Carlos Reyes was arrested on a Wednesday morning, 18 days after March 14th. The charge was theft. $50,000 from the company's safe at the Harrington Business Center were taken during the night shift on the 14th, a night when Carlos had been scheduled to work, had access to the building, had a key to the service elevator, and had, according to his supervisor, Dan Pryor, failed to notify anyone that he wouldn't be coming in. The text message Carlos had sent, Dan Pryor said he never received it. The phone records showed the text had been sent. Whether it had been received was another question entirely, a question that, in the absence of other evidence, the prosecutor chose not to pursue very hard. Marisol was at school when it happened. She came home to find two officers in the hallway and their neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, standing in her doorway with her hand pressed to her chest and an expression on her face that Marisol had never seen before on anyone and didn't want to see again. "Ma, they've taken your father," Mrs. Okafor said, because there was no gentle way to say it, and she was a woman who believed directness was a form of respect. Marisol stood very still for a moment. Then she put down her backpack. Slowly, carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are shaking and you don't want them to. And she said, "Where did they take him?" Mrs. Okafor told her. Marisol said, "He didn't do it." "I know, child. He was home with me. I was sick." Mrs. Okafor's eyes filled with something complicated. "I know. I heard him singing through the wall." This was something they would try to remember later. This exact sentence. The way it had come out so naturally. Just a neighbor's observation. Something unremarkable in the moment. Something that Mrs. Okafor had not thought to volunteer to anyone because no one had asked her. Because she was 73 years old and lived alone, and had been taught her entire life that people like her didn't offer themselves up to situations that involved police and prosecutors and courtrooms. But the truth was there, waiting, like it always is. To what Marisol found out. The public defender assigned to Carlos was a young woman named Andrea Solis, who wore her hair in a ponytail and carried 3 cases at once and did the best she could with what she had, which was not very much. She was not unkind. She was simply overwhelmed, and the case against Carlos was, on its surface, uncomplicated. He had access. He had means. He had no alibi that could be verified by anyone other than his teenage daughter. And in a daughter's words, she explained carefully, was not considered neutral testimony. "What about my word?" Marisol said. She was sitting across from Andrea Solis in a visiting room that smelled like cleaning fluid and stale coffee, and her hands were folded on the table the way her father folded his at school meetings. Deliberate, still. Andrea Solis looked at her with the particular expression of someone trying to be honest without being crushing. "The prosecution will say you love your father. They'll say you have reason to lie. I'm not lying. I believe you, but belief isn't evidence. Then what is?" A pause. "Something verifiable. Something that can be checked." He texted his supervisor. "The supervisor says he didn't receive it. My father doesn't lie." Andrea Solis said nothing to that, when Marisol looked at the table for a moment. "What happens if I testify? If I just tell them what happened that night? They'll cross-examine you. The prosecutor will try to make you seem unreliable. He might suggest you were asleep and don't actually know when your father left. He might suggest your father told you what to say. My father would never." "I know, but they'll suggest it." "And the judge? What kind of judge is she?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Judge Eleanor Marsh. She's been on the bench 22 years. She is fair. She is strict. She follows the law precisely." Andrea Solis looked at her pen. "She is not known for leniency. But she's fair?" "Yes." "Then fairness has to be enough," Marisol said, "because the truth is what happened." The Harrington World Warren Harrington Jr. Kate was 29 years old and had grown up in the kind of house where the word no arrived, so rarely it felt like a foreign language when it finally did. His father, Edmund Harrington, had built a small real estate management company over 40 years of careful, unglamorous work, buying and maintaining commercial properties, charging fair rents, keeping his name clean. He was a man of the old school. He kept his word. He paid his people on time. Warren had grown up watching his father do this and had concluded, somewhere in his mid-20s, that it was boring. Warren had expensive friends and expensive habits, and a gambling debt that had been growing for 2 years like mold in a wall, invisible from the outside, devastating within. He had borrowed from people who were not patient. He had made promises he couldn't keep. He had used his father's company name in transactions his father hadn't authorized, and the balance on those transactions was coming due in a way that was no longer abstract. The $50,000 in the Harrington property's safe was not company money. It was Edmund Harrington's personal savings, deposited there temporarily while he waited on a bank transfer. Warren knew this because he had been in the room when the old man put it there, and he had smiled and said, "Good idea, Pop," while already doing the arithmetic. He had planned it carefully. He had waited for a night when the regular janitor would have been there, giving himself cover. He had disabled one security camera and forgotten, in his haste, about the backup unit installed 6 months earlier. He had walked in at 11:15 and walked out at 11:47 and driven home through rain that had gentled by then, the sideways fury of it spent. He had not expected Carlos Reyes to be absent that night. When the theft was discovered and Dan Pryor, who owed Warren a favor, a fact neither of them ever said aloud but both of them lived inside, reported that Carlos had not notified him of his absence, the pieces arranged themselves into a story that Warren had not constructed but chose, deliberately and without visible hesitation, not to correct. Carlos Reyes, who had worked that building for 4 years, who had a key, who had access, who had no witnesses. It was, Warren told himself, just how things went sometimes. Before the trial, Marisol visited her father every week. The facility was a 40-minute bus ride, and she took it alone because Mrs. Okafor's hip made long trips difficult, and there was no one else. She brought him things: the crossword puzzles he liked, a thermos of coffee the way he took it, news from school, careful observations about the apartment she was maintaining alone. She'd fixed the cabinet hinge herself, she told him one visit, YouTube video and a screwdriver. He had looked at her with something in his eyes she hadn't seen before and couldn't name exactly. Something between pride and grief, as though he was watching her grow up in a direction he'd never intended. "The sign is still on the door," she told him another time. He knew which sign. "Of course it is. Your boots are on the mat." "Good. I cleaned them." He put his hand over his eyes briefly, a man trying not to. "Papa." She kept her voice steady, the way she had learned to keep it, the way he had taught her without meaning to. "We're going to fix this." "Marisol, I know what happened that night, every part of it." He looked at her. "Your word won't be enough, mija." "Maybe not my word alone," she said. She was thinking of something. She didn't say what yet, but she was thinking of the song. She had been thinking of it for weeks, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath. The verses, the specific, particular, verifiable details that a man makes up in the dark when he is trying to get his daughter to breathe. Details so small and unremarkable that no one would ever think to fabricate them, because what liar invents a thing about a radiator or a news segment about stadium lights? What fabricator buries their alibi in a lullaby? The truth, she thought, was in the song. The question was whether anyone in that courtroom would be willing to hear it. The morning of the trial, Marisol woke at 5:30. She lay in bed listening to the apartment, which was quieter than it should have been. No sound of her father in the kitchen, no smell of coffee, just the ordinary morning noises of a building waking up around her. She dressed carefully, the blue blouse, the school shoes, her hair braided as close to his version as she could manage. She ate half a piece of toast because her stomach wouldn't allow more. Mrs. Okafor knocked at 7:15. The old woman was dressed in her best coat and her good shoes, and she had brought a tin of butter cookies, which Marisol understood immediately as a form of love. A way of saying, "I am with you," in the language of practical women who have lived long enough to know that some situations cannot be fixed, only accompanied. They took the bus together. The courthouse was tall and stone-fronted, and the steps leading up to it were wide enough that they seemed designed to make you feel small before you ever got inside. Marisol climbed them steadily. Her hand briefly found Mrs. Okafor's arm at the top, then released it. Inside, she saw Andrea Solis near the courtroom door with her ponytail and her folders. She saw the prosecutor, a man named Gerald Fitch, known in this building as someone who rarely lost and knew it, talking to a younger colleague without looking up as she passed. And through the glass panel in the courtroom door, she saw her father. He already seated at the defense table in a borrowed suit. She recognized it as one belonging to their neighbor from the second floor. His hands were folded on the table exactly as they always were, back straight. He hadn't seen her yet. She pressed her hand flat against the glass for just a moment. Then she went in. The trial. The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor wax, and the particular cold that comes from stone walls that never quite warm. The gallery filled quickly. People from the neighborhood, people with no connection to any of this who had simply wandered in because some people treat courtrooms the way others treat libraries, looking for the texture of how things actually work. Then Judge Eleanor Marsh entered. Everyone stood. She was smaller than Marisol had expected. Then not diminished. Nothing about her suggested that, but compact, contained, precise. She moved with the deliberateness of someone who had learned long ago that rushing was a form of sloppiness. Silver hair swept back, eyes the color of winter sky, pale gray, moving across the room when she took her seat the way a searchlight moves, comprehensive, unhurried, leaving nothing unexamined. She sat, everyone sat. The trial of the people versus Carlos Reyes came to order. Gerald Fitch presented the prosecution's case with the quiet confidence of a man building a structure he had built many times before, placing each beam with practiced assurance. Access, means, opportunity, the absence of any verifiable alibi. The supervisor's testimony, he did not call in. I received no message. Dan Pryor testified smoothly. Oh, his voice calibrated to sound regretful. He wished Carlos had said something. He would have covered for him, he said, if only he'd known. The implications settled over the room like weather. Carlos had not wanted anyone to know he wasn't there because he had been somewhere else, doing something that required darkness and silence and the absence of witnesses. Carlos's hands stayed folded on the table throughout. When Andrea Solis cross-examined Pryor, she pressed him twice on the text message. He maintained he had never received it. Phones fail sometimes, he said. She asked whether he had a relationship with Warren Harrington Jr. He said they were acquaintances. She asked whether he had ever done favors for Warren Harrington Jr. The prosecutor objected. Sustained. The wall held. Carlos took the stand and testified quietly, steadily, the way he did everything. He had been home. His daughter had been ill. He had sent the message. He had not left the apartment. He described the night in plain, unembellished sentences. The rain, Marisol's breathing, the song, the chair he'd fallen asleep in, his boots still on his feet in the morning. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brief and surgical. You have no witnesses other than your daughter. You have no documentation. You have only your own account. Carlos said, I have my daughter. Your daughter, Gerald Fitch said, who loves you, who has every reason to say whatever is necessary to protect you. Carlos looked at him steadily. My daughter tells the truth. I raised her too. I'm sure you believe that, the prosecutor said, and sat down. Then it was Marisol's turn. She walked to the stand, sat down. She was aware of how young she must look, how small, how easily dismissed. She was 14. She was wearing her mother's blouse and her scuffed shoes and her father's braid. She told the truth, all of it, the tightness in her chest after school, the ginger tea, the inhaler twice, her father texting his supervisor while she watched, the television on in the next room, the news, the story about the stadium lights. She described it as specifically as she could recall, the rain that came sideways, the song, the new verse he added that night, about the clock, about the rain, about staying. My father does not leave when I am sick, she said. He has never, one single time, left when I am sick. That is who he is. Gerald Fitch was precise and patient and thorough, and he dismantled her testimony the way you dismantle something carefully, so the pieces can still be used later for something else. He questioned her memory, suggested she might have drifted off, suggested her father might have left after she'd fallen asleep. Noted gently that compromised oxygen sometimes affects recollection. She said, no. He asked whether her father had told her what to say. She said, my father told me to tell the truth. That is what I'm doing. When he sat down, Andrea Solis stood, paused, then said quietly, "Your Honor, the defense has no further physical evidence to present." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Carlos did not look up. Judge Eleanor Marsh looked at the room. Her pale gray eyes moved across it and settled, for just a moment, on Marisol. Something passed across her face that was not quite readable. Not sympathy exactly. Not its absence either. Something older than both. "Given the absence of verifiable corroborating evidence," Judge Marsh said in a voice that carried without being raised, "this court is prepared to move to—" "Your Honor." The voice was Marisol's. Everyone turned. She was standing. She did not know exactly when she had decided to stand. The decision had happened somewhere below the level of decision, in the same place where you decide to breathe. "Young lady," the judge's voice was not unkind, "you have already testified." "I know." Marisol's voice was steady. Her heart was not. "Your Honor, you said you need something verifiable, something that can be checked." She swallowed once. "There is evidence. It's just not the kind that comes in a folder." A murmur moved through the courtroom. "What kind of evidence?" the judge said carefully. "Who are you referring to?" Marisol looked at her father. He had turned in his chair. His face was the landscape she knew so well she could have drawn it from memory. The scar on his chin from a fall when he was young, the gray that had come in at his temples since her mother died, the particular quality of stillness he carried when he was trying not to show fear. She looked back at the judge. "The song," Marisol said, "my father sings to me when I'm sick. He always has. And that night he added a new verse about the rain, about the exact time, about what was playing on the television. Things you can verify. Things that only happened on that exact night. Things a person couldn't know unless they were there." Gerald Fitch was already on his feet. "Your Honor, this is—" "Mr. Fitch." The judge did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Yes, he sat back down. Judge Eleanor Marsh looked at Marisol for a long moment. 22 years on the bench. Exhibits and depositions and forensic reports and expert testimony. She had never in 22 years had anyone propose to submit a lullaby as evidence. "If you cannot provide evidence of your father's whereabouts on the night of March 14th, she said slowly, choosing each word as though lifting something fragile, "this court has no choice but to proceed to sentencing. He will go to prison today." Silence. Then she said something that surprised even herself. "But if you believe you have evidence, if you believe what you're describing can be verified, then I will hear it." A pause so brief it was almost not there. "The court will hear it. Speak." The courtroom was very still. Marisol stood in the gallery in her mother's blouse and her scuffed shoes, with Mrs. Okafor's hand somewhere behind her, and her father's eyes on her face. And she thought about all the nights he had sat on the edge of her bed when she couldn't find the bottom of a breath, his big janitor's hands warm and steady, his voice doing the work that medicine couldn't always do, filling the space between her ribs with something that was not quite air, but felt to a frightened child in the dark. Like enough. She thought about what he always said before he started. Every time without fail. "Just breathe, mija. I'll do the singing." She opened her mouth, and she sang. The sound she made was not beautiful at first. It was thin. The way a voice is thin when it is doing something the body did not plan for. When the throat tightens with the thing you are trying not to feel, when the air comes from somewhere deeper than your chest because your chest is occupied with the business of not breaking apart. It was the sound of a girl doing something terrifying and doing it anyway, which is the only way brave things have ever been done. But then something shifted. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound had nowhere to go but everywhere. She sang the first verse the way she had heard it 100 times, lying in the dark with the inhaler on the nightstand and her father's hand on hers. The simple version, the original one. The window holds the streetlight orange. The radiator clicks before it sighs. "I'll stay until your breathing settles. I'm until the night stops asking why." No one moved. Gerald Fitch had his pen raised above his notepad. He did not write anything. He held it there, suspended, like a man who had been interrupted mid-breath and had not yet decided whether to resume. Judge Eleanor Marsh sat with her hands folded on the bench in front of her, and her face was the face of someone listening. Not evaluating, not measuring, just listening. The way you sometimes can't help listening when something bypasses the part of you trained to analyze and goes directly to the part of you that is just a person. Carlos Reyes had turned fully in his chair. His elbows were on the back of it, and his big hands were gripped together, and his face was, it was a difficult face to look at. It was the face of a man watching his daughter do something he had no ability to stop. Something that was happening in the territory between love and law, where he had no jurisdiction. His eyes were bright and still and completely fixed on her. Marisol took a breath. The second verse was the one she'd heard 1,000 times too, but it had specific iterations. Weather-dependent, detail-dependent. And this was the iteration for winter nights, for rain. The rain came sideways off the river. The window looked like it was crying. I counted all your breaths between the gusts until the clock said 10, still trying. The court reporter had stopped typing. In the gallery, Mrs. Okafor sat with her butter cookie tin balanced on her knees and her eyes closed and her lips pressed together in the way of a woman who is keeping something in only by applying the full force of her dignity to the task. Then came the third verse, the new one. The one made on March 14th, in a specific apartment, in specific rain, at a specific hour, about specific things that had happened in the world that night and no other night. Things a father invented to occupy his hands and his voice while his daughter's lungs decided whether to cooperate. The clock said 9, the moon was gone, the rain came sideways down our street. I sang until your fever broke and felt your heartbeat slow to sleep. She paused, breathed, continued. The men on TV talked about the stadium, new lights for summer games, they said. The anchor smiled. The rain kept coming. I watched and sang and stayed instead. A small sound from somewhere in the gallery. Not dramatic, just the smallest involuntary release of breath, the kind a body makes when something lands in it without warning. The plant by the window needed water. Your mother's fern, the one that stays. I told it, hang on, just a little longer. I always say that. It always obeys. The fern, the particular fern that had been Elena Reyes's before she was Elena's, and had spent 7 years on the windowsill being talked to periodically, stubbornly alive. At 10:30, you finally settled. The chair by your bed was close enough. I dreamed of nothing. Woke at sunrise. My boots still on, so always tough. The last line was clumsy, metrically. He had never been a trained musician, Carlos Reyes. He had been a father in the dark, making do. That clumsiness was the realest thing in the room. Marisol finished. The note fell. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. Deeper somehow, the way water is deeper after something has moved through it. She stood with her hands at her sides and her chin up, and she did not look away from the judge. Judge Eleanor Marsh looked back at her. For 7 full seconds, Marisol counted them later, inexplicably, the way you count things when you need something your mind can hold. No one in the courtroom made a sound. Then the judge said, in a voice that had changed in some way, Marisol couldn't have named but could feel, Mr. Fitch, Mrs. Solis, I am calling a recess. 90 minutes. Court will reconvene at 2 o'clock. She picked up her gavel, set it down without using it, stood, walked through the side door. The noise that followed was not quite chaos and not quite not. People shifting, murmuring. The prosecutor leaning toward his associate with a hand over his mouth. Andrea Solis was already moving toward Marisol, her face doing something complicated and unguarded that Marisol had not seen it do before. Carlos Reyes sat very still at the defense table, and then he put both hands over his face. The room they put Marisol in during the recess was small and had a table and 4 chairs, and a water dispenser that made a hollow sound when it released air. Andrea Solis sat across from her. Mrs. Okafor sat beside her with the cookie tin open between them, which remained untouched. What I need to understand, Andrea Solis said, and her voice was careful in the way of someone trying to be precise rather than kind, though she was also trying to be kind, is whether any of those details can be confirmed independently. The news segment. The weather. The Stadium Lights story was the March 14th evening news. Or Channel 7, I think. That's what we usually had on. My father mentioned it the next morning when I was feeling better. I remember because he said the new lights would mean the games ran later, and that might mean noise in the summer. Marisol's voice was level. You can check the channel's archive. Andrea Solis was writing. The weather. There are weather records. The National Weather Service keeps them. The rain started before 7. I remember because I had already made the tea and it had gone cold by the time the rain started. And it was the sideways kind. He put that in the song exactly. Sideways off the river. The plant. My mother's fern. It's still on the windowsill. Mrs. Okafor saw it once. She was in our apartment 2 weeks before all this. Aunt, when she brought us food because I'd had a bad week with school. Marisol looked at the old woman. You saw it. The fern by the window? Mrs. Okafor said, without hesitation. I saw it. I told him it needed more light, and he said he knew. But Elena had always kept it there, and so he kept it there. A pause. I also heard him singing that night. Through the wall. Not the words, just the sound of it. A man's voice, low, like something you weren't meant to hear. Andrea Solis stopped writing. She looked at Mrs. Okafor. You heard him? Through walls like ours, you hear everything and nothing. I heard the singing. I heard it for maybe 2 hours. I thought nothing of it at the time. He sings to her when she's sick. I've always known that. The walls are thin. The old woman's voice was quiet and certain. A man who is committing robbery across town at 11 o'clock at night is not also singing through a wall at 11 o'clock at night. Andrea Solis put her pen down. Why, she said, to no one in particular. Didn't anyone ask you this before? Mrs. Okafor looked at her with the patience of someone who has waited a long time for obvious questions to be asked, because no one came to ask. The recess lasted longer than 90 minutes. It lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, and during that time several things happened that Marisol did not witness, but was told about later in pieces, the way you reconstruct a thing from its evidence after it has already happened. Andrea Solis made 3 phone calls. The first was to the National Weather Service, where a bored-sounding clerk confirmed that March 14th had seen significant rainfall beginning at approximately 6:50 p.m., sustained through 1:15 a.m., notable for its unusual lateral intensity due to wind patterns off the river. Sideways off the river. The second call was to the Channel 7 archives line, where she reached a researcher who confirmed that their March 14th evening broadcast had included a segment on Harrington Stadium's new lighting installation, anchored by a man named Pete Delgado, who had smiled throughout it because Pete Delgado smiled throughout everything. The segment had aired at 9:03 p.m. and run approximately 4 minutes. The third call was to the detective assigned to the original theft investigation, a man named Roy Calloway who had, 3 weeks into the case, received an anonymous tip that the building's backup security camera had been missed during the initial evidence collection. He had noted it, filed a supplemental report. The report had not been shared with the defense. The camera had captured footage that showed a person in the service corridor at 11:22 p.m. on March 14th. That person was not Carlos Reyes. When court reconvened, the room felt different. Not visibly, the same people in the same seats, the same stone walls, the same fluorescent light doing what fluorescent light does to every color it touches. But the quality of the air had changed the way air changes before a storm. When the pressure shifts and things that were in one arrangement begin, almost imperceptibly, to rearrange. Judge Eleanor Marsh entered, sat. Her face was the careful face of a judge, controlled and considered, but something behind the pale gray eyes had been moved by a fraction that Marisol could feel without being able to define. Andrea Solis stood. Her voice when she spoke had something in it that had not been there before the recess. Your Honor, the defense has become aware of evidence that was not previously disclosed to us. A supplemental investigative report filed by Detective Roy Calloway on March 29th indicating the existence of backup security camera footage from the Harrington Business Center. Footage that the prosecution had in its possession and did not provide to the defense. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the one after the song. This one had edges. Gerald Fitch was on his feet. Your Honor, that footage was Mr. Abe Fitch. Judge Marsh's voice had gone somewhere very still and very precise. Sit down. He sat. Ms. Solis, you are indicating that Brady material was withheld from the defense. I am, Your Honor. The judge looked at Gerald Fitch for a moment. The look had a quality to it that made three people in the jury box unconsciously lean slightly back. I would like to see this footage, Judge Marsh said. In chambers. Prosecution and defense both present. Now. They were gone for 41 minutes. Marisol sat in the gallery and held her hands together in her lap and looked at the back of her father's head and tried to breathe slowly and regularly the way he had always told her to. In through the nose, the count of 4. Out through the mouth, the count of 6. Mrs. Okafor put a butter cookie in her hand. Eat something, the old woman said. Your body doesn't know the difference between a courtroom and a siege. You need fuel either way. Marisol ate the cookie. The bailiff at the front of the room stared at the wall. The court reporter scrolled back through her transcript. 2 reporters in the back row were on their phones, and Marisol could see from the way they were typing that they were composing something, getting the shape of a story ready before they had all of it. Carlos had turned again in his chair. He was watching her. She met his eyes, and he did the thing he always did when she was scared, and he needed her to not be. Just held eye contact, not speaking, just staying. I'm here. I'll do the singing. Except this time it had been the other way around, and both of them were aware of that. To when the awareness of it moved between them like the chord after a song is done, still present, still felt. When the chamber door opened, Judge Eleanor Marsh walked back to the bench with a deliberateness that told the room something had happened in that room but gave nothing else away. She sat. She arranged the papers in front of her with precision. Mr. Fitch, she said, I'm going to give you an opportunity to address what we've just reviewed. Gerald Fitch stood. He had the look of a man who had recently recalculated something and was now doing the arithmetic of his options in real time. Your Honor, the footage was... He stopped, recalibrated. The footage shows an individual in the service corridor of the Harrington Business Center at 11:22 p.m. on March 14th. Much the quality of the footage makes identification. The footage clearly shows an individual who is not the defendant, Judge Marsh said. Her voice was stone even. The build alone is sufficient. Carlos Reyes is 6 feet and 2 inches. The individual in the footage is, by my estimation and by the estimation of Detective Calloway, whom I spoke with by phone during the recess, no more than 5 feet 8, and the individual in the footage was identified by Detective Calloway through additional investigation conducted after the supplemental report was filed as... She paused. The pause lasted only a second and a half, but it was the kind of pause that rewrites everything it touches. Warren Harrington, Jr., the judge said. The sound in the courtroom was not quite a gasp and not quite silence. It was the sound of a large group of people processing something at the same moment. The individual pieces of the noise assembling themselves from shock, confusion, recognition, and, in some corners of the room, the specific quiet of people who had suspected something without knowing what they suspected. Carlos Reyes made no sound at all. He put both hands flat on the table in front of him, and he breathed. If this story has found its way to you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Mama Told Me. Your support is what keeps these stories alive, and more of them coming your way. Warren Harrington, Jr. was not in the courtroom. He had not been in the courtroom for any of the trial. Why would he be? He was not a defendant. He was not a witness. He was in the framing of the story up until approximately 3:15 p.m. on that Tuesday afternoon, simply the man whose father owned the building that had been robbed. A victim's family member, tangential, unfortunate. He was at that moment in a restaurant 6 blocks away, having a lunch that had run long, eating something expensive, and conducting the particular kind of business meeting that was really an exercise in managing the distance between what people said out loud and what was actually happening. The man across from him, one of the creditors whose patience was now operating in negative numbers, had been speaking in a register that sounded reasonable and was not. Warren's phone buzzed. He didn't look at it. Well, he was in the middle of a sentence about liquidity and timelines and his father's assets and how the company's position was stronger than it appeared. It buzzed again and again. He excused himself, stepped away from the table, looked at his phone. 4 messages from his attorney, 2 missed calls from the same number, 1 text from a name he didn't recognize that contained 5 words. They have the camera footage. Warren Harrington Jr. stood in the corridor outside a restaurant bathroom and understood, in the particular way you understand things that you have spent a long time not understanding on purpose, that the architecture of his plan had just given way at the foundation. He sat down on a bench in the corridor. After a moment, he called his attorney back. And Marisol did not find out what happened in that restaurant corridor until much later. What she witnessed from the gallery was the immediate aftermath of evidence and truth doing what they eventually do when enough pressure is applied in the right places, which is to find the existing cracks and widen them into openings. Judge Marsh ordered the trial suspended pending a full review of the withheld evidence and the new identification. She directed that the prosecutor's office be subject to an immediate inquiry regarding disclosure protocol. She looked at Gerald Fitch in a way that did not require words, and Gerald Fitch received the wordless message with the expression of a man who has just understood, very precisely, the extent of a mistake. She ordered Carlos Reyes remanded to his family's custody pending review, effective immediately. The bailiff moved to escort him out and then stopped, because Carlos was already moving, toward the gallery, toward the small gate that separated the defendant's section from the public, toward his daughter, who had stood up without deciding to, who was already at the gate when he reached it. He put his arms around her. He was tall enough that her head fit under his chin, the way it always had, and he held her with the particular quality of a person who has been afraid for a long time, and is now, just now, releasing that fear into the only safe place he knows. She felt him breathe. She felt the breath in his chest, in, then out. The count of 4, the count of 6. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Behind them, Mrs. Okafor stood with her butter cookie tin held against her chest and allowed herself, very quietly, for just a moment, to do the one thing she had been keeping in since 9:30 in the morning. The investigation moved quickly after that, as investigations tend to do when the direction changes and what had been mud becomes suddenly clear water. Detective Roy Calloway had, it turned out, been quietly troubled by the case since the supplemental camera report. He was a careful man, methodical, unhurried, and he had noted the discrepancy in build between the defendant and the footage's subject early. But the footage had not been submitted as evidence because someone in the chain between collection and submission had exercised a discretion they were not entitled to exercise. The inquiry into that chain led, within a week, to 2 people whose professional relationships with Warren Harrington Jr. occupied a territory that the law described with words like obstruction and conspiracy. Dan Pryor's text message claim was re-examined. Phone records showed the message had been received at 11:04 p.m. The claim that it had not was exactly that, a claim. A claim made by a man who had received, over the previous 18 months, 3 deposits into a personal account from a shell company that traced eventually to Warren Harrington Jr. Gerald Fitch did not personally know about the withheld footage. He had taken, at face value, a summary report that had been selectively assembled. He had made the kind of mistake that is also a choice. The choice to not look harder, and to not press on what could have been pressed on, because the case was tidy, and tidiness is its own form of pressure. He faced consequences for that, professional and otherwise. They were not as severe as they should have been, and they were more severe than he had expected, and perhaps that was as close to justice as the situation could achieve. What justice could fully achieve took a few more weeks to construct, carefully, brick by brick, in the way that real reckoning requires. Warren Harrington Jr. was arrested on a Thursday morning. He did not fight it. He had spent the days between the courtroom and the arrest in a state of mind that those close to him later described, variously as shaken, deflated, and strangely quiet. The man who had moved through rooms with the confidence of someone who had never had to earn the space he occupied was found at 7 a.m. on a Thursday, sitting at his kitchen table in an apartment that cost more than Carlos Reyes made in 3 years, wearing a bathrobe, with a cup of coffee in front of him that had gone cold. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a man who had made a series of choices and had, perhaps for the first time, understood that choices were not hypothetical, that they lived in the world, that they did things, that they had found a janitor in a borrowed suit sitting at a defendant's table, and his daughter standing in a courtroom in scuffed shoes, singing the only evidence that existed. He told his attorney he wanted to cooperate. His attorney told him that was wise. The detail that circulated most widely after the story broke, in the newspaper, online, in the conversations people had in the neighborhood around Delancey Street and considerably beyond it, was not the withheld footage. It was not the forged relationships or the shell company or the gambling debts. It was the song. The girl who sang her father out of prison was how one headline put it, and Marisol found it embarrassing and also not quite right. But she understood why people needed a shape for the story, and sometimes a shape sacrifices accuracy for legibility. What she knew and what she kept was the more precise version. Her father had sung to her for 7 years in the dark. He had invented small, specific, true things to fill the space between her ribs when she couldn't breathe. And those small, specific, true things had turned out to be exactly the kind of evidence the law required. Not because someone had planned it, but because truth has a texture that invention doesn't. And texture, if you know how to feel for it, can be verified. Mrs. Okafor gave a formal statement that confirmed the sound of singing through a thin wall on the night of March 14th for approximately 2 hours. This was corroborated by weather records confirming the rain's character and the news archive confirming the segment's airtime. The fern on the windowsill had been photographed by someone from the attorney's office, still in its place, still alive, still needing more light than the window gave it, and receiving that light anyway, because it had always been there. Small things. Unremarkable things. On the kind of things a man makes up in a dark room for his sick daughter, not knowing they are building anything, not knowing they will be needed, not knowing that the careful, ordinary truth of his love will one day be the only thing standing between him and a sentence he didn't deserve. 2 weeks after Carlos was returned home, Marisol came back to school. It was a Monday. She walked through the front entrance and found that things were simultaneously exactly the same as they had always been and permanently altered in a way she couldn't yet describe. Her locker was the same locker. Her first class was still math, so taught by a man who found algebra the most beautiful thing in the known universe and communicated this enthusiasm with an intensity that most of his students found somewhere between admirable and exhausting. She sat in her usual seat. The girl next to her, a girl named Priya who had been her friend since 7th grade and who had the quality of someone who sees clearly and says very little, leaned over when the teacher was writing on the board. "Are you okay?" Priya asked. Marisol thought about the question. "Yeah," she said. "I think so. I heard what you did." Word gets around. "You sang in a courtroom." "Yes." Priya was quiet for a moment. Then, "Was it scary?" Marisol remembered standing up without deciding to stand up. Remembered the thin sound her voice made at first, the way it steadied. Remembered the particular silence that had followed. Not the silence of a room ignoring you, but the silence of a room listening. "Everything real is scary," she said. Priya nodded as though this was exactly the answer she'd expected. What Marisol did not know yet, what she would not know for another week, when a letter arrived at 4C Delancey Street in an envelope with the return address of a law office. A different law office from Andrea Solis's, an office on the kind of street that had uniformed door attendants and polished stone floors, was that Edmund Harrington had been reading about the case. Edmund Harrington, 71 years old, who had spent 40 years building his company on the understanding that a man's word was the most valuable thing he possessed and could be lost only once, who had watched his son become something he did not recognize and had not found a way to stop it, and had carried the weight of that failure the way old men carry such things, quietly in the body, in the early morning hours when sleep won't return. He had read about the text message, about the withheld footage, about Dan Pryor, and he had read about a 14-year-old girl who had stood up in a courtroom in her mother's blouse and her scuffed shoes and had sung, because it was the only evidence she had, and she had been right. He had sat with the newspaper for a very long time. The letter that arrived at 4C was not long. Edmund Harrington was not a man of elaborate language. He had written it himself in longhand, on plain stationery, and the handwriting had the slight tremor of old age, but not of uncertainty. Dear Miss Reyes, the letter said, what my son did to your family is the worst kind of wrong. The kind done by someone who believed that the people he harmed were not quite real. I cannot undo it. I would like, with your permission, to begin. Below that was a proposal, not an apology dressed as charity. A specific, practical, concrete proposal, written in plain language, for what restitution could look like between a man who had resources and a family that had been harmed. Marisol read it twice. Then she brought it to her father. Carlos read it, standing in the kitchen, still in his jacket from the shift he'd just returned from. His supervisor, Dan Pryor, had, following certain events, been replaced, and the new supervisor had reinstated Carlos within the week without any conversation that anyone needed to pretend had not taken place. He was back to work. The boots were back on the mat. The sign was still on the door. He read the letter, folded it along its original crease, set it on the table. What do you think? Marisol said. He looked at his daughter for a moment. She had grown somewhere in the past several weeks, not physically. She was still 14, still slight, still wearing her mother's blouse when she thought it suited the occasion. But in some way, that didn't have a word for it yet. The way a person grows when something hard has passed through them and they have let it pass and not been destroyed. I think, Carlos said, choosing each word, that this man's son did something terrible, and this man is trying to be accountable for it. He didn't do it. No, but his son did, and he is this son's father, and he knows that a father is not separate from who he raises. A pause. I know something about that. Marisol looked at him. Not the same kind, he said, but the knowing, the understanding that you carry what your children do in some way. She thought about that. So what do we do? Carlos picked the letter back up, read one line again, the one that said, I would like, with your permission, to begin. We let him begin, Carlos said. The beginning looked like this, a phone call first. Marisol's idea, she was the one who suggested it, because letters had a quality of distance that felt wrong for what needed to happen. And she had grown in the past several weeks into someone who trusted her instincts about what felt wrong. Carlos called the number on the letterhead, and Edmund Harrington answered on the second ring, as though he had been waiting, which perhaps he had. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Carlos said very little. Edmund said more than he'd planned to. When it was over, Carlos stood in the kitchen for a moment, with his hand still on the phone, and then he went and sat on the edge of Marisol's bed, the way he had sat on it 1,000 nights, and he told her what had been said. Edmund Harrington had proposed, specifically, the reimbursement of all legal costs incurred by the Reyes family, a formal written acknowledgement, for any purpose they might need, that Carlos Reyes had been wrongfully accused and that the false accusation had originated in circumstances connected to his family. And this was the part Carlos relayed slowly, as though he was still processing the shape of it. A scholarship fund established in Elena Reyes' name, air for students from their neighborhood pursuing any field they chose, in Elena's name. Marisol said nothing for a moment. Then she said, he didn't know her. No. How did he know her name? Carlos was quiet. I think, he said, that he read everything, that he felt the need to understand the full shape of what his son had done to us. All of it. Not just the accusation, the years before it, the reasons it mattered. Marisol thought about a 71-year-old man reading about their life, reading about her mother, reading about the apartment on Delancey Street, and the boots on the mat and the fern on the windowsill that still needed more light than the window gave it. He wanted to know who we were, she said. Yes. Before he tried to fix anything. Yes. She looked at her hands. Sure, that matters. I thought so too. The scholarship was announced publicly 6 weeks later. By then, Warren Harrington Jr. had entered a plea. His sentencing was scheduled for the spring. The plea included full restitution to the Harrington Properties Company account, cooperation with the investigation into the broader network of financial fraud, and an acknowledgement, on the record, in his own words, read aloud in the same courtroom where Carlos Reyes had sat in a borrowed suit, that Carlos Reyes had played no part in any of it. Marisol was not in the courtroom for Warren's plea. She had been asked if she wanted to be. She had thought about it carefully, the way she was learning to think about things, fully without rushing, turning them over to see all their sides. And she had decided no. When I don't need to watch him say it, she told Priya, who had asked. Why not? Because it doesn't change what I already know. And being in that room again, she paused. I don't want the courtroom to be the place I think of when I think of how this ended. I want to think of something else. What? Marisol thought for a moment. My father in the kitchen, making rice, the bay leaf and the butter that don't belong there. Priya looked at her with the expression of someone who understands something without knowing all of it. Okay, she said. The first recipient of the Elena Reyes Scholarship was announced in June. It was not Marisol, who was 15 by then, and who had her own ideas about her future that she was still constructing, slowly. With the same methodical care her father applied to the list on the refrigerator. It was a boy named Jerome, a senior from 3 blocks away who wanted to study environmental engineering and who had spent the previous 3 years working weekends at a warehouse to help his grandmother with rent. He found out he'd been selected via a letter that arrived on a Saturday morning, and his grandmother, who had been awake since 5:30 baking something, came to find him sitting at the kitchen table with the letter in both hands, and tears running down his face in the uncomplicated way of someone who hasn't yet learned to be embarrassed by relief. She didn't ask him what it said. She just put a plate of food in front of him and sat down across from him and waited. He told her. She pressed her lips together. And then she said, "Who is Elena Reyes?" Jerome read her the brief description that had accompanied the scholarship announcement, the paragraph Edmund Harrington's office had written, that Carlos and Marisol had approved, that described Elena as a woman who had raised her daughter to believe that truth was not optional and that the people who held it were not powerless, regardless of what they owned or did not own. His grandmother listened to all of it. Then she said, "I want to write them a letter." "Okay." "Not to say thank you, to say I understand why they did it." Jerome looked at her. "What's the difference? Thank you is about me. Understanding is about them." She got up, went to find paper. "They named it after someone they lost. They made something from it. That's not something you just say thank you for. That's something you bear witness to." Edmund Harrington sent Carlos a letter after the scholarship announcement. 3 paragraphs, handwritten, the tremor in the letters more pronounced now. He had been ill, it turned out, had been ill for some time, and the events of the previous months had accelerated something in his body that had already been in progress. He wrote that establishing the scholarship had been the first thing he had done in a long time that felt fully right. He wrote that he had spent 40 years building his company on the belief that reputation was built from the ground up, from small, honest things, and that he had watched his son dismantle that belief from the inside without finding a way to stop it, and that the weight of that was something he would carry. And he wrote one other thing. He wrote that he had thought a great deal about the song, about the fact that a man had been singing to his sick daughter on the night that a theft was being committed in his building, about the accident of it, the purely accidental quality of the truth, that the alibi had been a lullaby, that the evidence had been love. "I have been trying to understand," he wrote, "what it means that the truth of your innocence was preserved in something so private, in something that was never meant to be seen, in something that only existed because you stayed. I think it means that the kind of man you are cannot be hidden, even when no one is looking, even when there is no audience, even when it costs you something to be that kind of man. My son was watched constantly. He had every advantage, every resource, every opportunity, and he became something smaller. You had none of those things, and you became something larger. I don't know how to account for that, except to say that I believe it is the most important thing I have learned in 71 years. And I am grateful at the end of things to have learned it." Carlos read the letter at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with his coffee. Marisol was still asleep. The apartment was quiet in the particular way of Sunday mornings. The radiator clicking before it sighed, the streetlight outside finally losing its color to daylight, the fern in the window beginning to lean, as it always did, toward whatever light was available. He folded the letter, put it in the drawer where he kept the things he wanted to keep, the things that were too important for a stack but too private for a frame. He sat for a while. Then he got up and started the rice. Judge Eleanor Marsh retired 14 months after the trial. It was not, her clerk told people who asked, connected to the case. She had been planning to retire. The timing was a coincidence. But the clerk who had worked with her for 9 years and who knew the precise architecture of her silences, the way you know the precise architecture of any space you inhabit long enough, noticed that something had changed in the judge in the months following. Not dramatically, not in a way that was visible from the gallery or the press bench, but in the way she sat, in the way she listened. There was something slightly less sealed about it, something that admitted a quality of. The clerk searched for the word and found, eventually, wonder. Not naivety, not sentimentality, just the quality of someone who has been reminded, after a long time, that the things they cannot predict are not always terrible. She had been a dancer before law school, Eleanor Marsh, not professionally. She had been good, but not that kind of good, and she had known early the difference and made peace with it. But she had danced until her 30s, in the deliberate way she did everything. And then the law had taken over the hours, and dancing had become something she had once done. Past tense, a room she'd closed the door on. In her retirement, she opened the door again. Not ballet. Her knees had their own opinions about that now. But she found a class on Sunday mornings, an instructor who specialized in teaching people who thought they had missed their window. And she went, initially because her doctor had suggested movement, and then because something happened in the second class that she had not expected. She was not thinking about the courtroom. She was not thinking about anything in particular. She was following the instructor's directions, moving her arms in a specific way, feeling somewhat foolish, and then something released in her chest, some clasp that had been fastened so long she'd forgotten it was there, and she thought, quite suddenly and without logic, of a 14-year-old girl standing in a gallery in scuffed shoes, doing the terrifying thing anyway. She kept going to the class. She did not tell anyone why. Some things are private. Some things belong to the interior of a life, to the room where the things are kept that are too important for a stack, but too private for a frame. Anna and what the judge carried from that courtroom was hers, and she held it with care, the way you hold something you didn't know you needed until it was given to you by someone who didn't know they were giving it. The night before Marisol's 15th birthday, Carlos knocked on her door. She was at her desk, doing the kind of homework that required looking at a problem from enough angles that the right angle eventually became obvious. She had a quality for this, her math teacher had told her recently, with the particular satisfaction of someone naming a thing that has been waiting to be named. You don't give up on a problem, he'd said. You just keep looking at it until it shows you something. He had meant it as a compliment about algebra. Marisol had understood it to be true about more than that. Her father came in and sat on the edge of her bed, the way he always had, the way she hoped he always would. He had something in his hand, a small box, the kind that could have held any small thing. Jewelry, a watch, something practical. Early, he said. Papa, my birthday is tomorrow. I know, but I wanted to give this to you now, tonight. There's a reason for the timing. She took the box, opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper. She looked at him. He nodded toward the paper. She unfolded it. It was handwritten. His handwriting. The careful, slightly slanted print of a man who had taught himself to write neatly because his early schooling had not done it for him, who had practiced until it became something he was proud of in the quiet way he was proud of things. It was the song, all of it. Every verse written out fully, much including the new one. The one about the clock and the moon and the sideways rain and the stadium lights and the fern by the window and the boots still on at sunrise. Every word exactly as he had sung it, transcribed the way you transcribe something you want to keep. Not because you might forget it, but because writing it down is a way of saying, this happened, this was real, This mattered. At the bottom, below the last verse, he had written something that was not a verse, just a sentence. For Marisol, who knew that the truth was in the song before anyone else did. She read it twice, the way she read everything important, once for what it said, once for what it meant. She looked up at him. When he was watching her with that expression she had come to know better than almost any other thing, the one that was both the saddest and the most certain expression she had ever seen on a human face. The expression of a man who has understood, through the long education of loss and love and the specific labor of raising a daughter alone, that what you give a child is not what you plan to give them. It is what you actually are, daily, unremarkably, in the dark when no one is watching. The love that doesn't perform because there is no audience. The love that sings because singing is what the moment requires. The original, he said, is yours. I have it memorized. She folded the paper back along its creases, held it. I want to add a verse, she said. He looked at her. A new one. For this year. For everything that happened. She looked at the paper in her hands. The song should have it. It's part of the story now. Carlos was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. She thought for a while. He waited. Outside, the street made its usual sounds. A bus, someone's music 2 floors up, the corner store's delivery arriving late. The radiator clicked, then sighed. She said, she stood and sang what couldn't be presented, the truth too plain for papers and for proof. A father's voice, a daughter's faithful keeping, the love that stayed became the only truth. He repeated it back to her, softly, checking the words. That's it, she said. He nodded. He would add it. He would carry it. They sat together on the edge of the bed for a while after that, not speaking, which was its own kind of language between them. The language built over 15 years of mornings and evenings and asthma attacks at 2 a.m. and homework and rice with bay leaf and a mat by the door with a sign that said Boot Graveyard and a fern that refused to die no matter how little light it received. The language of people who have stayed. 2 years on from that Tuesday in March, Marisol Reyes was 16 and studying for the test that would determine what came next in the sequence of her life. She was good at math, as established. She was also, her English teacher had recently informed her, a writer, which surprised her and did not surprise her, the way the truest things tend to do. She had been asked by a journalist writing a piece about the case whether she would be willing to say something about what had happened, what she had learned. She had agreed because she had thought about it enough by now to have something real to say, and saying real things felt like the minimum requirement. She had said, people talk about evidence like it's something separate from life, like it lives in folders and on camera footage and in documents with signatures. And sometimes it does. But on the night my father was home with me, the evidence was a song. It was the specific words a person invents when they are present in a specific moment, when they are watching a specific rain out a specific window, when they are counting a specific person's breaths. You can't fabricate that. You can't plan it. It can only exist if you were actually there. She had paused. Wes, the journalist, had not filled the silence. My father stayed because I needed him. That's all he was thinking about. He wasn't thinking about proof. He wasn't thinking about alibis. He was thinking about my breathing. Another pause. And that's exactly why it was true. The most honest thing is always the thing you do when you're not thinking about being watched. The journalist had asked, what do you want people to understand from what happened to your family? Marisol had thought about Edmund Harrington reading about her life, about Jerome opening a letter at a kitchen table, about Mrs. Okafor's hand on her arm at the top of the courthouse steps, about Judge Eleanor Marsh's face in the moment after the song ended. That fraction of movement in the pale gray eyes, where that almost imperceptible shift in something that had been sealed for a long time. She had said that the people who get overlooked are not actually invisible. They're just in rooms where no one has thought to look. A breath. And that truth has a texture. If you learn to feel for it, you can find it anywhere, even in a song. Carlos still sings. He sings when he is working, quietly below the range of most people's hearing. A habit so old it has become involuntary, the way breathing is involuntary. He sings when he is making rice on Sunday mornings, adding the bay leaf and the butter that don't belong there culinarily, and that tastes exactly right. He sings when the apartment is quiet and he is moving through it, doing the small maintenance of daily life. Odd of fixing the things on the list on the refrigerator, adding new things as they present themselves, working through them methodically, steadily, the way he has always done everything. He doesn't sing the new verse often, but sometimes when the city outside is doing what the city does on rain nights, when it comes at an angle, when it hits the window the way it did on March 14th, when the radiator clicks 3 times before it sighs, he sings it under his breath. She stood and sang what couldn't be presented, the truth too plain for papers and for proof. A father's voice, a daughter's faithful keeping. The love that stayed became the only truth. Marisol usually hears him. She usually doesn't say anything. She just hears it, through the wall or through the half-open door, and she lets it be what it is, a true thing, carried, anchor added to, kept alive. Mama always said that the truth doesn't need an audience to be true. She said it finds its way out, even through the smallest opening, even through the throat of a girl in scuffed shoes on a Tuesday afternoon, in a room that smelled like old wood and cold air, and the particular weight of something that is about to change. Even then, especially then. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. Mama always said the people who stay for the whole story are the ones who understand it. If it moved you, I think you'll find the other videos on your screen are waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come home. There's always a story waiting at Mama Told Me.